There's been no shortage of sandbox games since the dawn of the generation. Franchises which were usually home to linear, story-driven titles suddenly became these sandbox behemoths, while the established giants of the genre like Rockstar continued to deliver the deepest maps on the market. Of course, with so many open-world games being created, it was inevitable that a good chunk would fall a little short. What's often the most disappointing part of getting a bad open-world game isn't just repetitive game design or a lifeless story though. Oh, no, it's when the sandbox itself is beautifully detailed, but the gameplay just doesn't do it justice. You can tell that the artists spent countless hours to painstakingly recreate iconic cities or come up with their own imaginative locations, only to have all that effort completely wasted on games which players just didn't want to stick with. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 incredible open worlds wasted on disappointing video games. Number 10, Paris, Assassin's Creed Unity. Although they righted the ship now, it shouldn't be underestimated just how much of a disaster Assassin's Creed Unity was for Ubisoft's premier franchise. The game buckled under its own ambition to have city streets littered with NPCs, with the strain its huge, dense world put on the game engine, resulting in a title full of bugs and faces that melted straight off characters' skulls. But one thing which did remain intact during this broken launch was the gorgeous recreation of French Revolution-era Paris. The attention to detail, just like in most Assassin's Creed games, was astonishing, with both the massive exteriors and interiors holding up under scrutiny. The architecture of the time is of course the biggest highlight, and it was still awesome to climb to the highest peak and sit in wonder at what the artists had created. Unity's vision of highly populated cities was noble, and it's a shame that the final product didn't have the power to support it. Number 9, Medici, Just Cause 3. While a lot of developers have moved away from the bigger is better mentality in recent years, there are still a bunch desperate to hold the title of having the largest sandbox any game has ever seen. Just Cause 3 was one of these games, and when it released back in 2015, was essentially built around the idea of being the most open world game, with its map of Medici coming in at a whopping 400 square miles. It's not the most detailed place in the world, but the vibrancy of the islands with the lush greenery complementing the striking blue ocean made every action in the game picturesque. In a way, it kinda made you feel a little bad that you were blowing the whole thing to smithereens. Just Cause 3 can be a lot of fun, but it undoubtedly suffered at launch thanks to an engine that struggled to keep up with the scale of the action. To say the frame rate was unstable would be polite, and even after plenty of patches, there was the feeling that the sequel wasn't as polished as it could have been. Number 8, Chicago, Watch Dogs. It was difficult to properly analyze Watch Dogs' visuals at launch, because no matter how good they may have been at the time, they were inevitably compared to those impossibly beautiful pre-release trailers. Consequently, its open-world version of Chicago was criticized for not being as picturesque and dynamic as it was supposed to be, even though it was a damn fine playground to hack your way through. Chicago is an interesting city in media, as while it doubles for a lot of places in movies, for instance Gotham City in Batman Begins, it rarely ever shows up as itself. The team at Ubisoft more than did it justice though, creating a modern metropolis faithful to the actual city. There was also this cool new feature that made it look like buildings had interiors, which, trust me, blew everyone's minds back when this game came out. It's admittedly not as detailed and exciting to explore as the second game's version of San Francisco, but it still deserves lots more love. Number 7, New Bordo, Mafia 3. Mafia 3 could have been something special. All the cards were lined up. You had a great protagonist in Lincoln Clay, an emotionally affecting plot, a brilliant socio-political climate to mine, and, of course, a lifelike world to explore in New Bordo. Unfortunately, while all of those features can be appreciated in isolation, the repetitive mission design the game is lumped with completely stops you appreciating the sequel as a full package. Essentially a stand-in for New Orleans, New Bordeaux provided a great dichotomy between the city streets and the nearby swampland, which were, of course, full of alligators that could handily dispose of bodies for you. However, it was the vintage late 60s setting that made it something special, with period-authentic architecture and iconography littering the map to give it such a distinct, unique look and atmosphere. It's not part of the open world, but the pitch-perfect soundtrack cruising down the streets to Eve of Destruction, for instance, definitely didn't hurt either. Number 6, Post-Apocalyptic Earth, Rage. The gaming world is not in need of any more post-apocalyptic sandbox games. By now, the setting is about as overdone as zombies are enemies, but back in 2011, it was actually a rarity. Sure, you had Fallout 3 opting for a semi-realistic version of a bombed-out Washington, D.C., but there was little else in the AAA space at the time. In came id Software's Rage, a first-person shooter set in a post-apocalyptic version of Earth that had been destroyed after colliding with an asteroid. The design itself was more alien than realistic, focused on scorched deserts and shantytown outposts. It was cool, and it was definitely not like Mad Max. Why would you ever bring such a thing up? I mean, look, it's definitely not copying Mad Max. I mean, honest, they don't even know what Mad Max is. The most important thing Rage actually did, though, was making this sandbox feel like a place where humanity was actually trying to rebuild. Sure, it looked a little bit like other movies and games, but that didn't matter, because the developers made you believe this place could actually exist. It's just a shame the shooting itself was completely lifeless. Number 5, the Andromeda Galaxy, Mass Effect Andromeda. With Mass Effect Andromeda, BioWare had free reign to go absolutely nuts in coming up with whatever crazy designs the minds of their artists had to offer. Worlds that would make H.P. Lovecraft weep, architecture not made for humans, aliens made entirely of testicles or something, I don't know, anything. They could have gone mad. The options were limitless, but sadly, for the most part, the Andromeda system was full of the same sci-fi iconography fans had been subjected to for years. Still, the distinct planets you could land on were fun to explore, especially with the weird environmental problems each one came with. Crashing down on these uncharted planets and figuring out a way to make them hospitable really made you feel like a proper explorer, out on your own and discovering things no human had ever laid eyes on before. That loop could have been the focus of a whole game, but as it stands, it's obfuscated by a pretty terrible plot and side missions that make you feel less like an adventurer and more like somebody's personal assistant. Number 4, the entire USA, the crew. America has, understandably so, always been present in video games. Usually devs will pick one iconic city and attempt to bring it to life. Let's face it, it's usually New York, but the crew decided to go one step further. Rather than settle for a single city or even a single state, the racer would cram the entirety of the USA into a single game's map. Ubisoft's ambition was certainly gigantic, but the most surprising thing was that they actually accomplished what they set out to create. While of course it wasn't a one-to-one recreation of the country, driving from city to city and state to state was a joy. Taking a cool drive from LA to New York, for instance, felt like an actual road trip, as even bombing down streets at over 100 miles per hour would result in it taking well over 30 minutes to get from one city to the next. Detail was sometimes lacking, but it was still impressive to travel around and see the sights. Sadly, Ubisoft gave players very little incentive to do so, as the actual races themselves weren't all that enjoyable, and even with other players being visible, the experience was kinda lonely. Number 3, 20th century London, Vampyr. Late 1800s / early 1900s London has been represented in video game form a couple of times this generation, between Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Vampyr, and frustratingly, both times it hasn't been done justice. It's perhaps the latter title which feels like the biggest missed opportunity though. The supernatural RPG from Dontnod certainly showed promise, but it was far too unrefined to break out of its little niche audience of die-hard fans, even in spite of its haunting early 20th century setting. With the dense streets being torn apart by the Spanish flu, Vampyr had the perfect backdrop to tell its horror tale, but while London itself was awesome to explore and awarded the game with such rich atmosphere, that's pretty much all it had going for it. It's still worth picking up for the period setting alone, but you won't escape the feeling that the devs could have done so much more with it. Number 2, Appalachia, Fallout 76. If there's one word to describe Fallout 76 that isn't broken anyway, it's uninspired. From the design of the missions to the loot to the mere fact that it's a games as service title, the release is devoid of any real creativity. However, that same apathy towards imagination thankfully didn't extend to the setting, Appalachia. Unlike most sandboxes in this franchise, Appalachia is unique in how it actually wasn't destroyed by the nuclear apocalypse. Instead of being bombed, it was simply ravished by radiation, meaning that most of the buildings are left intact, only completely empty and devoid of human life. Not only does this award the game with a particularly eerie quality, but it makes the player feel like they're rediscovering a lost relic, the remains of a time gone by that juxtaposes with just how dead the world actually is. There's so much variation to the map as well, it's just a shame that it's all undone by bugs and glitches that take almost everything away from what intrigue this setting could have held. Nope, I am not still bitter. Why do you ask? Number 1, Manhattan: The Division. As mentioned previously, there have been plenty of video games that have used New York City as their setting. From every single Spider-Man title ever made to Grand Theft Auto to Crysis 3, the Big Apple has been imagined and reimagined countless times in video game form, but never as well as in The Division. The dystopian shooter might have had uninspired gameplay, but its desolate version of NYC, abandoned one Black Friday and still decked out in Christmas lights and decorations, is haunting. There's something so creepy about the city being so desolate, not destroyed or decaying like in other post-apocalyptic media, simply empty. It helped that the developers managed a one-to-one recreation of part of Manhattan as well, which really captured the scale of the location. It's not that the map itself simply felt large, it was more that the player was made to feel small, as they were surrounded by these winding streets and impossibly high skyscrapers. It was easily the best part of that original game, and it's a shame that it's been chucked out entirely for the sequel, especially because you could have brought in other boroughs of NYC to make the game world even bigger.
Much as we'd like to resist its charms, the hype train is a very easy vehicle to board. It's so easy to be swept up and along with sweet promises of games that are just over the horizon. More often than not, fans are left looking at their new game with quizzical expressions, as this is most definitely not the product they thought they were getting. I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 overhyped video games that became massive disappointments. Number 8, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. What could have been, eh? At one point in time, the Marvel vs. Capcom IP was hotter than Johnny Storm with a fever, and was dominating esports events left, right, and centre. With each passing entry, the roster and respect for the series seemed to balloon and balloon. However, with Infinite, things burst in pretty spectacular fashion. The hype was most definitely real for the game when it was announced, with publisher Capcom proudly announcing that they saw this once again becoming the fighting game of choice for pros. They even teased a new fighting mechanic that would incorporate the Infinity Stones to help players field teams of differing quality and use said stones as a leveler. Yet, the hype began to wobble intensely as soon as certain questions were asked, namely, what the hell is up with these graphics and where the hell are the X-Men? To which the devs bungled responses of, well, we'll try and fix that, and you don't need the X-Men, other characters will fill those roles anyway, only stirred the pot. When the game landed with a thud, it wasn't because of the impact of its intentions, but because of its weak story mode, pathetic roster, and bare-bones online, causing it to trip and land on its face. Ouch. Number 7, Mass Effect Andromeda. I don't think you can have a discussion about overhyped disappointments without including the likes of Mass Effect Andromeda, because not only was this a long-awaited return for one of the industry's favourite franchises, but was also something of a clean slate for the developers going forward, as they tried to move away from the rather sour note ending of Mass Effect 3. In the lead-up to launch, we got hit with all the tried and tested notes, the huge lens-flared sci-fi aesthetics, the oncoming threat of a new evil, and of course, a heavy emphasis on player choice and exploration backed up with fleshed-out party members who you would be prepared to die for. However, upon launch, the only death here was the players dying a little inside as they witnessed the myriad of glitches and bugs that simply should not happen in a game this size and of this pedigree. What was once pride in the series turned into a mortifying experience of watching others mock the title online with a compilation videos and analysis of the balked character designs. While things weren't terrible across the board, with the combat in particular being more than acceptable, everywhere else the game sags like loose skin on a rotting corpse. The story felt ham-fisted, the party members annoying, and the mission structures lifted from other generic RPGs with little care. This was less a love letter and more a post-it note with sex scrawled all over it. Number 6, Battlefield 2042. Now, it might be too early to call Battlefield 2042 a massive disappointment, but when you look at the fan backlash the game is receiving in its opening weeks, it's safe to say that many aren't feeling that their faith and money has been well placed. Hard crashes are prevalent, lag spikes are causing weapons to feel like spitball shooters, hovercrafts and other vehicles are overpowered and making a mockery of the in-game physics. And it's all wrapped up in a title that feels anemic for long-term fans and almost cringeworthy to others as it desperately tries to chase the likes of Overwatch and Call of Duty with its focus on specialists and extraction royale style modes. Add to this a supremely limited amount of weapons and maps, and you can't look at this title without seeing the grim spectre of EA lingering over things, hoarding up all of the good items and maps for DLC or microtransactions. Lest we not forget, a special edition of this game costs upward of £200, and this, alongside all of the marketing blitz that promised the best Battlefield ever, left many fans feeling like their wallets had been hit as hard as they were in the heart by EA's latest skipfire. Fingers crossed for the fixes, right? Maybe in a year or two this will be the game it promised to be on launch. Number 5. Lawbreakers. Gears of War mastermind Cliff Bleszinski once lamented aloud to the press that he was honestly shocked and kind of disappointed that no other developer seemed to want to try and integrate the active reload feature that was so prevalent in his meaty shooter series. Now, the man had a real point, as I can't think of another title that actually made the act of reloading pretty fun. But clearly Cliff and his team at Boss Key weren't so shy when it came to borrowing ideas, because when it came to Lawbreakers, they were definitely interested in chasing trends rather than setting them. Things began so well for this project, as not only was Cliffy B doing his usual masterclass routine when it came to PR and advertising, and every outlet that got their hands on the title was reporting how well things looked and played, but the hype train became derailed in dramatic fashion thanks to one simple fact. On the one side, we had the likes of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and on the other, we had Overwatch, and Lawbreakers just didn't do enough to sway either community to give it a look. By playing things too safe, even weeks after launch, the player base for Lawbreakers was dwindling, and the title became an example of an overhyped project that hit the water at speed but just couldn't make a splash. Number 4. Marvel's Avengers. The greatest heroes finally assembled in one place. How could this be anything other than a smash hit delivered with the power of the Hulk? Well, it turns out that when you stuff your generic action title with enough oily microtransactions, bizarre corporate tie-ins, and put in a grind so heavy that even Destiny players looked at it and said, "Whoa, that's a bit much," then not even Earth's mightiest heroes could save the day this time. Now, to its credit, there are elements where Avengers shines, namely that with a group of friends, it can make for an enjoyable, if slightly mindless, smash and bash experience. However, we need to remember that even activities like, urinating on puppies is slightly more fun with friends involved, so maybe that doesn't carry much weight. And we also need to remember just how much this game was overhyped by Square Enix in the lead up to its release. Not only did they promise action far above what was delivered, but the single-player campaign that was heavily touted as being a key selling point was drab, flat, and padded out beyond all reasonable doubt. And when server issues continued to plague launch, it meant that early adopters were left with a bit of a beached whale. And if you don't consider the game to be a disappointment yourself, Square Enix certainly did, as they went on record to blame Crystal Dynamics for the poor reaction and sales Avengers generated. Pretty harsh. Number 3. The 3D Mario All-Stars Pack. It almost feels wrong to bag on a Mario game, such is the usual quality that each of the portly ex-plumber approaches his titles with, but when it came to the recent 3D Mario All-Stars pack, what should have been an utterly butterly dream turned into a curdled nightmare. Well, for some hardcore fans at least. Containing Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy, one can't exactly look at this pack and not immediately feel like a syringe of pure hype has been injected into your spine. But things hit like a savage come-down once fans realised that they were actually getting the most inferior versions of these classic titles, with Mario 64 in particular, which runs off of the Shindu version, meant that many glitches and bugs that speedrunners used were removed entirely. As a result, this hardcore subset of the community had little reason to buy this pack, and for those that were still interested, well, they were put under undue pressure by Nintendo themselves when it was revealed that the collection would have a limited physical and digital release, meaning that after March 2021, no more new copies would be sold. This move alone added to the overblown hype of a lazy collection of ports, in turn only highlighting the disappointment felt by so many. Smooth moves, Nintendo. Number 2, Cyberpunk 2077. Talking about Cyberpunk, for me especially, is a rather draining task, as I was so on board the hype train for this that I wasn't just in first class, I was up at the front shoveling coal on the fire for the drunken deranged train operator. I wanted to love this game so very much because it seemed to tick all the boxes, even those that I didn't know needed to be ticked. A grimy sci-fi setting, a huge open world to explore, body modifications aplenty, it sounded too good to be true, and that's because it was. From review outlets playing versions of the game on PC that were far more stable than both the console generations, which then slanted perspective on the title, to the litany of bugs and issues that rendered the game unplayable for many, Cyberpunk's cyberfunk hit hard and wallowed for weeks after launch, thanks to issues with the devs not being able to patch the title and even a supposed hack of their own database. When Cyberpunk shines, it's like a brilliant diamond, but all too many times it was just buried by absolute cack, and not even the delightful Keanu Reeves could save this project from being rightly lambasted for its poor quality control. Again, my heart wants to tell me that this game will become a rightful masterpiece in time, but for many, the damage has already been done. And number 1, Balan Wonderworld. What the hell is going on here then? That was legitimately my response to seeing Balan Wonderworld for the first time, a title that I'd heard many murmurs about, seeing as it was being headed up by Sonic and Dreams into Night's creator Yuji Naka, while also getting a shedload of funding from purveyors of fantasy Square Enix. Screenshots from the game began to whip the world into a frenzy, as here it really looked like the title would be a kind of kaleidoscope of fun and frantic platforming set against aesthetics that were inspired by a bloody acid trip. Off-the-wall characters in an utterly insane world, sign me up. However, the only collider here was reality smashing gamers in the face upon launch, as in short, this title was not good. Now, if I were a simple man, I'd say that the game should have been renamed Bland Blunderworld, but even that poor wordplay is honestly better than some of the aspects of the title. Balan Wonderworld is a title so laced with broken aspects that it feels like walking on smashed glass, with each rubbish power-up, invisible wall, or abysmal QTE cutting the skin of the hyped-up fanbase deeper and deeper. Yet, the worst aspect of it all, the bloody dance sequences. Honestly, I could see my own skeleton at these points because my skin tried to invert itself at the sheer cringe. No thank you.
The issue of managing a video game follow-up is a universal one across all scales of production. Fans want more of the same, but not too much. They want a budding series to evolve and grow, but not to fundamentally change. In some cases, a sequel arrives that gets the balance just right, but often expectations are outrageously high and disappointment is all too common. Whether because they took off in a strange new direction, lacked that star quality that came before, or were just mediocre, I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 most disappointing video game sequels of all time. Number 10, Paper Mario, Sticker Star. Longtime players of the Paper Mario series generally know what they're getting into. A colourful, irreverent experience that leans into the whole everything is made out of paper concept and emphasises it throughout. For many, 2004 GameCube title Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door represented the pinnacle of that format. It's tremendously fun and varied, with a large cast of characters that each have handy abilities in battle. The RPG elements seemed finely tuned to allow for strategy without becoming too deep or too shallow. Titles since though seem to have failed in getting this delicate balance right. 3DS installment Paper Mario Sticker Star remains a controversial example, leaving behind those RPG trappings for the gimmicky titular sticker system, and being a landmark disappointment because of it. It might not be too bad a title, the stickers can be fun to experiment with and the writing is on point, but talk about a drop-off from what came before. Number 9, Prince of Persia, Warrior Within. Okay, full disclosure, I always loved this game. I mean, look at me. Godsmack's I Stand Alone as the theme song, gaming did not get any better. Talk to anyone whose blood didn't bleed professional wrestling at the time though, and Warrior Within was a cataclysmic, nigh hilarious letdown. Going from the super charming Sands of Time original to this weirdly super angsty muted colour palette sequel that felt like the boss's teenage son had led the design meeting. Because to give the haters their due, Sands of Time was a magical fairy tale game, boasting fantastic platforming sections that showcased the prince's remarkable athleticism and time powers. Controlling the sands let you rewind to undo deaths, or bust out some sand powers in combat. Warrior Within then largely nailed its combat and level design, but went so all in on a Jak 2 or Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness style tone that many players just couldn't accept it whatsoever. Losing the softly spoken prince that went before, follow-up Two Thrones attempted to hybridize the two styles into a twin gameplay approach. However, that just resulted in a reboot because Ubisoft couldn't think of a genuine way to truly move forward. Number 8. Dragon Age 2. The Dragon Age series represents BioWare at their best, a deep, involving set of RPGs with choices, consequences, and lots of dialogue. It's a version of the legendary developer we may never see again, but that hot streak run across the 2000s is always worth admiring. Dragon Age 2 then represents a turbulent time in the series. Hawke's adventure is one that never quite seemed to know what it wanted to be. It offered the player more freedom than before in terms of the choices they made, but its questionable pacing meant that you were never quite sure how or when they would actually matter. Most egregiously, Dragon Age 2 struggled to carve out a world that was truly its own, with some very familiar looking settings popping up throughout. It's a shame, as Hawke is a memorably written character for those who stuck with the game until the credits, but this sequel was the first major stumble for a studio that would only fall apart more across the ensuing decade. Number 7. Resident Evil 6. There will always be highs and lows for any long-running series. In the case of Capcom's beloved survival horror franchise Resident Evil, the 6th numbered release would probably qualify as a major low. Resident Evil 4 had changed the formula forever. It implemented a new visceral action-focused 2 proceedings and pulled it off with purpose, charm, and memorability. It's one of the most celebrated games ever made, and the pressure of following it up was pretty immense. In attempting to do so, Capcom gave us Resident Evil 5 and 6. The former may not be a masterpiece, but it remains an enjoyable enough action-heavy romp, packed with some of the most absurd and memorable moments the series has to offer. Resident Evil 6, though, just took things too far. Trying to please what had now become two audiences, those of slower-paced horror and high-octane action, none of Resident Evil 6's smaller campaigns felt like Resident Evil at all. Capcom would take a long, hard look at themselves across 5 whole years of letting the IP rest before coming back stronger than ever with Resident Evil 7, Village, and an ongoing smattering of remakes. Whether they try to make 6 work after all this time, though, is something we'll just have to wait and see. Number 6. Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2. Adaptations of beloved franchises like Star Wars need to be treated with tremendous care. Fans are as invested as it's possible to be, and for Star Wars, they want authenticity across their games. The most iconic characters, vehicles, and locales, combat that feels just right, plus epic space battles and cosmic drama worthy of the name. Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2 had a great chance to deliver all of this. An expanded take on new canon character Starkiller could have been a visceral treat to control as before, with many expanded force powers and lightsaber tricks going down in history. Sadly, the game was a big critical disappointment, failing to refine the solid foundation the original had set down. It would later be revealed that the game was crunched to hell and turned around in just 9 months, something that resulted in Force Unleashed 2 feeling like DLC. Poor sales followed, and when Disney took over Star Wars in 2013, plans for Force Unleashed 3 were scrapped entirely. Number 5. Duke Nukem Forever. A lot was riding on 2011's Duke Nukem Forever. It needed to honor the Duke's not-so-good name and prove a worthy addition to his adventures that had come before. Sadly, the project just seemed doomed from the start. Duke Nukem Forever's sad fate is one of the most infamous tales of development hell in gaming history. Once it finally arrived in players' hands, it was plain just how far the genre had come, leaving the Duke far behind. Forever was filled with some insanely outdated jokes likely written almost a decade prior, and was a very basic FPS, failing to provide any innovation or a fresh feel to gameplay like the mighty Duke Nukem 3D once did. Number 3. Devil May Cry 2. Few games debut with so much confidence, swagger, and all-round panache as Devil May Cry. Spinning off from a Resident Evil 4 prototype and including enemy juggles as a game mechanic thanks to a bug in development, tagging on a red coat wearing demon hunter who quipped and flipped in equal measure was instant gaming history. It was all massively helmed by one Hideki Kamiya, director of Resident Evil 2, who'd go on to make some of the most stylish games of all time. So what to do for Devil May Cry's sequel? Well, how about you get in a completely different director, then swap another in with only a few months before launch. The resulting version of Devil May Cry 2 had wall running and multiple enemy targeting, but precisely none of the raw playability and appeal of the original, replete with a Dante that felt stripped of all personality. Number 2. Fable 3. On its 2004 launch, this vast, ambitious, Peter Molyneux-designed RPG delivered creative, engrossing gameplay. In itself, many had an issue with how overblown Molyneux's marketing tactics had been versus the reality of the game itself, but being a major, well-playing Xbox-exclusive RPG, en masse, we kinda just let it slide. Fable 2 then hit supremely well too, leading to a Part 3 that got everything wrong. Lacking the weighty decisions that made Fable identifiable, also stripped back were your clothing options, weapons, and RPG customization across the board. Even the game's pause menu was just weird, booting you into a room of options that you literally had to walk around. Fable is currently in reboot mode yet again after the practically finished Fable Legends was shelved instead, but Fable 3 was a monumental letdown. And number 1, Dead Space 3. There's Resident Evil 4 and there's Dead Space, the perfect twin over-shoulder shooter combo. For the latter, Isaac Clarke fights with salvaged mining tools, battles are frantic, gross and gory, and there's a killer atmosphere that brings it all together. For Dead Space 2, everything got enhanced. Combat proficiency, animation, monster design, lighting. For many, Dead Space 2 is the peak of action meets horror in all of gaming to this day. With so much love for 2 installments creating one hell of a trajectory, in came what we now know all too well as EA royally messing everything up. Series creator Glenn Schofield was long gone, and in were premium currencies, microtransactions, co-op shooting campaigns, and an evil moon as a boss fight. It all went sideways fast, undoing all that previous goodwill and benching Dead Space as an entire franchise until EA finally greenlit a remake in 2021.
Because capturing the interest of an audience is so important, sometimes video game developers sell their project on a new mechanic you may never have seen or heard of before. Sometimes these mechanics turn out to not be necessarily as good as you were hoping they might be, however. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 overhyped game mechanics that were a complete disappointment. Number 10, Realistic Interrogations, LA Noire. LA Noire is one of the more ambitious Rockstar projects when it comes to innovation. The game's goal was to create a realistic 1940s detective experience by making the witnesses and suspects express the most subtle emotions on their faces with the latest motion capture technologies. And by latest, that was the standards of 2011, which is probably why this revolutionary feature ended up looking more comical than immersive. Instead of serving as a window into the suspect's psyche, however, the expressions your character's interviewees made were either stupidly easy to read or so grotesquely contorted that you had to double check you were still talking to a human being and not some kind of malfunctioning shapeshifter. You can't deny LA Noire's ambition, but its core mechanics simply aren't as impressive as its developers anticipated. It makes for an entertaining spectacle in the vein of a circus show, but if you're looking for a proper interrogator simulator, you unfortunately need to search for it elsewhere. At least Detective Elf's drawings looked really good. That was something. Number 9, Hacking, Watch Dogs. As far as Ubisoft's franchises go, Watch Dogs is one of the most controversial. The series has a very vocal group of haters online, and most people would agree that its first installment is not nearly as impressive as the trailers made it out to be. The core element of Watch Dogs gameplay is hacking. You play as a rogue hacker who's capable of jacking into things like people's phones and even Chicago's entire traffic control system. The 2013 trailers for the game made the hacking look as though it would make your character a digital god, capable of turning off electronic devices in the entire city with one click of a button and sowing wireless chaos wherever he went. However, when excited players finally got their hands on Watch Dogs, the reality definitely didn't match the expectation. Not only were the hacking mechanics not nearly as cinematic and advanced as their trailer counterparts, but the game was also filled with bugs, which made even the most impressive of your abilities, like stopping and controlling cars, look like an absolute joke. Maybe the developer should have learned how to fix software problems before trying to emulate the hackers who create them. Number 8, Create Your Own Character, Sonic Forces. In terms of Sega's worst, Sonic Forces is definitely up there. After years of mediocre Sonic games, it's hard to get too excited about the next one without adding a caveat of, unless they screw it up again. Forces manages to do very little to make a case against the argument that 3D Sonic had gotten stale to the point of soullessness. The greatest testament to this is the most overhyped feature of the game, the character creator. The 2017 announcements for Forces were proudly boasting about the title allowing the player to create their very own Sonic the Hedgehog character, basically fulfilling the dreams of every Sonic fan out there. However, the character creator in the game is done in such a lazy and lackluster way that even the most hardcore Sega fan can't get anything out of it. The game limits you to only one body type, a small handful of animal species to pick from, and then a pitiful selection of clothes that look like a poor college freshman's wardrobe. Even when you try to recreate already existing characters with the creator like Sonic or Shadow, your creations end up looking like cheap knockoffs. It's actually a pretty good summary of how this character creator feels when compared to most other modern creators. Speaking of which, number 7, Character Creation, Cyberpunk 2077. Give this video a like and a subscribe if you were disappointed by Cyberpunk's character creation, because ho Nelly. Although Cyberpunk has been trying to make up for its initial flop with patches, series and the new DLC, it's still undeniable that its original release was a huge betrayal of people's expectations. The most frequently lamented part of Cyberpunk is the game-breaking bugs plaguing the streets of Night City. However, another big concern were the undelivered promises regarding the game's mechanics, one of which was the underwhelming character creator. The teasers and previews for the game boasted about character creation being an incredibly expansive and immersive experience. Everything was supposed to be customizable, from the character's body parts and cybernetics to their life path and origin story. Not only that, the changes you made would greatly impact the gameplay by unlocking new features and special dialogue options. Suffice to say then that the released version of the mechanics were severely watered down. The features were present in the game, but the appearance customization was reduced to basic sliders, and the cybernetics and lifestyle options barely made any difference, providing only a handful of minor changes to the game. It's the type of uninspired experience that no samurai would want to wake up for. Number 6. Settlement building, Fallout 4. In 2015, Fallout 4 was one of the most discussed topics on the internet. You wouldn't be able to come across a site that wasn't talking about or hyping up the series' 4th installment in some way, except maybe your grandma's Facebook page. Forget it, she was excited about it too. One of the most frequently teased mechanics that Bethesda couldn't stop talking about was the new settlement building feature. The mechanic was supposed to allow the player to populate the barren wasteland of the Commonwealth and turn even the most desolate junkyard into a vital part of the region's community. However, as is usually the case with Todd Howard's sweet little lies, the end product left much to be desired. Though the system would allow you to populate select parts of the Commonwealth, the building mechanics were very limited. You only had a few building materials at your disposal, and each building location had a restrictive limit on the number of objects you could place. Not to mention the members of your new community were all generic lifeless settlers with hobbies like clipping through walls and refusing to follow basic pathfinding. You know, in other words, they were your typical Bethesda NPCs. Number 5. 256 endings until dawn. Every time a new major supermassive release comes out, the same bold claim begins to circulate on the internet. The game includes a ridiculously high number of endings. The Quarry supposedly has 186, and Supermassive's original horror title Until Dawn has 256. But is that really true? Well, anyone who's played these games can tell you with full confidence and frustration, no. There are only actually 3 distinct endings, one for saving everyone, one for letting everyone die, and one for saving some people. The big numbers actually refer to the combinations of choices that can lead to these endings, but these combinations don't actually impact anything at all, as each survivor responds in the same exact way to their companion's survival or deaths, regardless of how many or how little you manage to save. The hype surrounding Supermassive's endings is not only misleading, it also makes for a really disappointing experience if you decide to replay either one of their major releases. This is just the same thing that happened last time. Number 4. Going full open world, Dragon Age Inquisition. Dragon Age is a series that changes themes more frequently than some people change their bed sheets. I'm looking at you, when was the last time you did it? Starting off as a classic RPG with a slightly low fantasy angle, it transformed into an open world high fantasy experience that is supposedly going to add God of War style combat in the next installment, Dreadwolf. But for now, let's talk about the shift towards open world gameplay, mainly how it turned out to be a lot less fun than it should have been. Before Dragon Age Inquisition was released, many of the series fans were quite excited by BioWare's announcement of adding open world exploration to the title, finding new exciting places to visit and discovering more about the famous regions in the game. Unfortunately, the open world ended up being the weakest part of Inquisition. The explorable regions were barely populated by anything, and aside from a few landmarks here and there, the landscape looked generic and boring. It felt like the maps were put there to pad the game's runtime more than anything, preventing you from reaching the actually fun story parts of Inquisition. Number 3. Randomized Galaxy, No Man's Sky. In terms of level of uncontained hype and the global disappointment that followed, No Man's Sky is easily up there with Cyberpunk 2077. Admittedly, the game has been releasing frequent updates over the years that majorly improve the experience, but it's still nowhere near the potential that everyone expected that it would have. Before its underwhelming release, No Man's Sky was seen as one of the most ambitious open world projects, in large part thanks to the promised mechanics that were supposed to create a unique, one-of-a-kind galaxy for each and every player. Every solar system, moon, and planet was supposed to be randomly generated, starting with the basics like planet shapes and locations, and ending with more specific parts like flora and fauna. To say this didn't happen would be a big understatement. No Man's Sky's random generation actually turned out to be procedural, and pretty terrible procedural at that. The planets all looked identical, barren and generic, and the animals resembled improperly assembled Lego characters rather than actual creatures. Instead of a boundless galaxy to explore, No Man's Sky ended up being a repetitive trek through some empty dirt patches with an occasional abomination of nature to laugh and or cry about. Number 2. The morality system, Fable. Over the years, Peter Molyneux, the creator of Black and White and the Fable series has gained a reputation as an overselling con man within the gaming community. His notoriety can mostly be attributed to his exaggerated promises of Fable's hyper-advanced mechanics. If you were to trust Molyneux's words back in 2004, just like many other excited gamers did, Fable would have felt like an almost lifelike experience. The game was going to let you live out your character's life in its entirety, have children with your spouse, and have its world evolve right before your eyes, as showcased by Molyneux's infamous example of a tiny acorn growing into a tree. But did any of that actually end up in Fable? No, of course not. The game included none of the above mentioned mechanics, and those that were present felt basic and gimmicky at best. Now, the game was still fun, of course, but when the producer promised that you'd be able to see every wrinkle appearing on your character's face in real time, and all you got was a bunch of lazy time skips and pre-rendered models, it's hard not to feel disappointed. And number 1, Species Evolution, Spore. The lost potential of the god simulator Spore is one of the greatest disappointments in gaming history. The number of projects like Species and Thrive that try to revive Will Wright's original vision of Spore should be a good testament to that. During the early development of Spore in 2004 and 2005, the game was going in a completely different direction than the final product. Spore was aiming to be a more realistic experience, featuring more detailed graphics and game mechanics like additional evolution stages, more in-depth character customization, and an actual exploration of planets during the space stage. Eventually, however, a part of the development team came to the conclusion that the game would be more appealing to a wider audience if it adapted a more simplified and cartoonish approach to life simulation in a similar vein to Max's hit Sim series. This idea was later adapted by the rest of the developers, and Spore was turned into the watered-down, kid-friendly version of itself that became the final product. This said, the footage of the original realistic Spore has not been forgotten, and to this day many players wonder about what could have been.
I think it's fair to say that boss battles, they're quite an integral part of the video game experience. Under the right circumstances, a challenging foe or nasty antagonist can hook players so effectively that it will carry them through to the close of the narrative like hobos being drawn to the aroma of a freshly baked pie. Still, we're all hungry little tykes and therefore are always looking for a good boss battle that'll push us to our limits and beyond. Yet not all encounters are created equal, and for every wondrous conflict that comes about, there's 20 or so that will give us a stomachache in the worst possible ways. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 8 most disappointing boss battles, and say it with me kids, of all time! Number 8. Natla, Tomb Raider. When the original Tomb Raider was selected to be remade with shiny new graphics and updated gameplay in the form of Tomb Raider Anniversary, one of the few key aspects that fans of the original desperately wanted to see changed was its final boss battle with Natla. And why was this? Well, because it absolutely sucked, that's why. Built up across the title as a figure of raw, pure power, as well as being the former ruler of Atlantis, it's safe to say that fans were expecting a showdown for the ages. But what we got, however, was a floating pixie-looking creature firing off projectiles that looked like boiled hams that could be gunned down in just a few well-placed shots. Seriously, if you just flip left and right while holding down the trigger, you'll be done in mere moments, leaving a rather bitter taste in your mouth that all of this build-up was just a fart in your face. Luckily, Anniversary changed the battle immensely, providing one of the most exhilarating moments in the entire game. Number 7. Lady Comstock, BioShock Infinite. I know that a lot of people will immediately think of Frank Fontaine's Last Stand when it comes to rather disappointing BioShock boss battles, as, you know what, it really did feel out of place to suddenly take on discount Dr. Manhattan over here after all of the mind games that we've been playing up until that point. However, in terms of unadulterated anger that was generated by fans, Lady Comstock kicks Frank right in his Atlas globes. The real problem with this boss is the fact that it's been built up to be so much more. From snippets beforehand, we're led to believe that the vengeful spirit will provide the player with the greatest challenge thus far, and yet how it delivers this challenge is akin to piss-taking. Instead of a clever battle which utilized Elizabeth's tears, instead there were only tears of frustration as Lady Comstock soaked up bullets and cast Raise Dead over and over. This battle was an intense chore that highlighted the worst things about Infinite: the damage sponge enemies, the weird insistence to make you change weapons to inferior ones, and having to hide behind cover until Elizabeth finally woke up in order to help you out. On 1999 mode, this was harder than any other encounter and is rightly hated for its pointless grind. Number 6. Dracula, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. Poor old Dracula, you really have to feel sorry for him in the Castlevania games, as while he portrays himself as being the Dark Lord of all that is unholy, he routinely gets his fangs banged in with rather terrible final boss fights. The reason why so many of his iterations have been sent back to the crypt in short order is usually down to just how overpowered any respecting Castlevania player is at these points, rocking offensive health pools and crazy damage output because they explored all of Dracula's haunted house. However, even in games that don't turn the player into an almighty badass by this point, you can sometimes eliminate poor Dracula before he's even got out of his bloody chair. Take for example the abysmal final boss fight against him in Simon's Quest, where Dracula slowly rises from his chair spouting something along the lines of "I'm going to suck," and then boom, he's dead. Well, at least what he actually got to say was true. Even if you don't have the fire weapon required to burn his soul to cinders in seconds, the fight itself is woefully short and underbaked. Maybe this is why he spends so long in his coffin, as you know what, he needs a century or two for anyone to forget about these embarrassing boss battles. Number 5. Ganon, The Legend of Zelda, Wand of Gamelon. Okay, so maybe we should definitely preface this title a little, because Ganon, as a character, is one of the most feared adversaries in video game history. No matter his form, whether pig demon or gigantic entity of destruction, one thing has remained constant throughout, namely that he's capable of enslaving the world with his almighty power, and that fighting him is akin to trying to swim the Atlantic, but the water is made of acid, and that it's a horrific challenge and you're bound to lose some skin on your thumbs. So with this in mind, how do you think fans felt when they experienced a Ganon boss battle in The Legend of Zelda Wand of Gamelon, which ended in just one hit? Pretty disappointed, I'd reckon. Now, to be fair, the disappointment levels were already at an all-time high, or should that be low, in these CDI titles, mainly because it looked like it was bashed out at a Game Jam weekend and then animated on MS Paint. But this final boss battle truly was the final nail in any hopes that fans had of an enjoyable time. Here, this master of magic stands perfectly still on a small platform, hurling what looked like moldy jack-o'-lanterns at you, which might as well be called caco-lanterns, and awaits for you to climb the ladder and throw a wand in his face. It's over before you know it, and you know what? Maybe that's a good thing. Number 4. The Destroyer, Borderlands. It's a giant squid thing that comes out of nowhere, kills who should have been the original final boss, and then proceeds to stink up the joint with a terribly forgettable encounter. The Destroyer is the absolute pits, only earning its namesake for destroying the fun that we were having in this title thus far. To add real salt to the vault, it turns out that the riches that you were promised for opening this mythical cavern of wonders were just lies, and the only thing on the other side was pure disappointment. Cheers, Borderlands, way to serve us a 4-course meal and then finish things off by spitting in our post-dinner coffee while looking at us in the face, and then charging us for the privilege. Number 3. The Other Player, Deathloop. Now, before you get your pitchforks and cast me into the fires, I have to admit that I think that the recently released Deathloop is bloody brilliant, and is so for so many reasons. The way it approaches the "let's set up things now for great payoffs later" is a brilliant mechanic, as is the process of learning patterns, making mistakes, and then trying out new ploys until you got that perfect run. However, there's one aspect of the game that can, and I do want to emphasize can, provide one of the biggest disappointments, and ironically, it's a feature that was championed pretty bloody heavily in the lead up to its release. I'm speaking, of course, about the fact that another player can invade your game world and take on the mantle of rival assassin Juliana, and can hound you throughout the world as you attempt to break the loop. Now, on paper, it's brilliant, and in most instances, it is totally brilliant in practice as well. But there's a reason why this feature is optional, and that's because sometimes it can provide the most deflating experience ever. Going up against griefers, having your plans utterly ruined in an instant, and being put in an unwinnable position thanks to resources just not being what you need to counter another fully armed player can create an utter grind, creating a player-controlled boss battle that really makes you want to rewind time all over again. Number 2. Killer Croc, Batman Arkham Asylum. If we're being brutally honest, Arkham Asylum has got some pretty ropey boss battles in it. I mean, seriously, when you boil it down, outside of the brilliant Scarecrow sequences, who really stands out as a good boss? The giant Bane-like enemies? I mean, they got boring the moment that you made them run into the wall for the first time and then realized that this was their only gimmick. And the less said about the final Joker showdown, the better. So who's left, really? Oh yeah, that's right, Killer Croc, and my lord, talk about a disappointment. This villain is built up so heavily before his final encounter monster that it's easy to imagine that he might be one of the final bosses of the entire game. The sheer menace and horror of his design is terrifying up close, and as you descend into the bowels of the sewers, that creeping dread is fully realized as it becomes clear that you are not alone down here. Yet what follows is the equivalent of a jump scare in a horror movie where it turns out to be nothing more than a cat just knocking over a bin, because the actual battle with Croc boils down to him running at you like a moron and you bantering him off with a batarang. The fact that he does this multiple times and doesn't even learn how to attack in any other way almost relegates him from being a boss battle at all. He's merely just a quick time encounter, and this character deserves way more than that. And number 1, Prowling Magus and Congregation, Dark Souls 2. Oh dear, what in the name of the Chuckle Brothers is going on here then? So Dark Souls is a franchise that is famed and indeed feared for its intense boss battles. Each and every one of these nightmare spawns will poke and prod your very soul with incredible damage, insane resistance, and of course, a good old dollop of pure BS. That being said, not all of these bosses were fun to fight, and a handful, dare I say it, could even be considered bad, lest we not forget the design team even out and out apologized for the Bed of Chaos fight and its absolutely dreadful "guess you stood on the wrong tile, idiot." However, when it comes to disappointing, there's only one real candidate. The Prowling Magus and Congregation is both the easiest boss fight in pretty much all of Dark Souls and the most pathetic, comprising of just a group of slow shuffling bodies and a spellcaster who coughs out magic as deadly as a cup of lukewarm tea. The shock of walking into this area to find a surprise boss is left in pieces moments later when you're standing atop a pile of bodies and you realize he didn't even break a sweat. Hell, they're so utterly incompetent that they make Pinwheel look deadly, and that is saying something.
Video games have to master every single thing they set out to accomplish to be considered true masterpieces. But sometimes a video game might do really well in one particular aspect and just happens to drop the ball on a few others. It can be disappointing to see a game excel at its core mechanics but fumble in areas like world building, narrative, or replayability. The games on this list all have incredible core gameplay loops and, in some cases, even mechanics that marked the height of their respective franchises. Ultimately, though, they dropped the ball elsewhere and managed to disappoint players. This article is inspired by a Reddit thread by user Night Train, so let's tuck right in and you can let me know which ones you agree with. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video games with excellent gameplay that still disappointed. Number 10, Borderlands 3. It's not often that the third entry in a series is the best, but curiously, plenty of fans credit Borderlands 3 with having the best weapons and gunplay in the entire series. The 2019 action role-playing game from Gearbox Software took advantage of the lessons from its predecessors and impressively refined the gameplay formula. The third entry also has a great selection of classes and interesting characters that elevate the moment-to-moment gameplay loop. Unfortunately, the elements outside of the core mechanics and main characters really let fans down, particularly in the story choices. Players weren't happy about Maya's treatment, the predictable plot with one-note villains, leaving out fan-favorite Vault Hunters with little satisfactory explanation, Ava in general, and its treatment of the Tales from the Borderlands characters. Outside of that, players were not on board with the writing or the comedy, and weren't pleased to see characters like Zero become caricatures of themselves. Feel free to turn down that dialogue volume though, and have a blast with the gunplay, stellar map design, and thrilling boss fights. Number 9, Halo 5 Guardians. If you're a Halo fan, I'm betting that you saw this infamous entry in the FPS franchise coming. The 2015 shooter had multiple games to figure out what fans wanted from its combat mechanics, and it delivers those in spades in Halo 5. The core gameplay loop within the campaign and multiplayer modes consists of arguably the best gunplay in the series. Meanwhile, the janky squad AI and extraordinarily lackluster story that ignored any direction fans actually wanted it to go are a huge detriment to the overall experience. The maps and gameplay types are controversial at best, and while new additions like Warzone did have some fans, it was otherwise pretty universally disliked. Number 8, Fallout 4. Now, Fallout 4 isn't a terrible game by any means, but like many other entries on this list, if it wasn't for its excellent gameplay, it might have been a total swing and a miss. The Fallout series started tremendously strong with its first 2 entries, and even when it did a bit of a genre swap for Fallout 3 and New Vegas, it continued to give fans what they wanted out of an engaging post-apocalyptic RPG romp. Unfortunately, it's all been downhill since then, and while Fallout 4 didn't disappoint in the same way Fallout 76 did, it probably should have been a warning sign. The repeating quests and busy work, while presumably intended to enhance the game length and amount of quests, just frustrated and bored players. As for its story, unfortunately Fallout 4 had these huge shoes to fill and just couldn't manage it. Exploring the world quickly feels like a grind, and the side missions just aren't compelling. This would add up to a game that's pretty tricky to engage with, except that the core gameplay feels great. Shooting is fun, the variety of guns and how they feel to use is excellent, and becoming a wasteland powerhouse is as cool as it's ever been. On the flip side, fans were also bothered that the progression from underdog to fully equipped hero felt way too fast, because of the early appearance of power armor and legendary energy weapons. Fans have said that the combat in this game is the very best of the series, even topping that of Fallout 76, although you'd be excused if you, like me, played it for about 50 hours and gave it away because you just didn't care anymore. Number 7. Vindictus. If you're not an MMO fan, there's a chance your radar never registered the 2010 MMORPG Vindictus. It's a free-to-play game that offers a variety of classes as set characters. At launch there were 5 and now there are 19. MMORPGs have a ton to juggle at the best of times, but Vindictus has been pretty universally praised for its combat. Players enjoy the fact that every character is unique with their own class that provides a pretty natural re-entry point for returning players to try their hand at each additional new character. While the core gameplay loop has been praised, Vindictus disappointed, largely due to publisher Nexon gating dungeon progression for those that wouldn't put in a ton of time or real-world dollars. Players have bemoaned the mission structure, the lack of support for solo players, and uninspiring story elements. If the combat and large variety of characters does it for you though, this might still be one to check out. Number 6. Mass Effect Andromeda. I'm playing through the Legendary Edition of Mass Effect right now. I've already made it all the way to 3, and while there's a lot of fantastic things about these games, the combat leaves a lot to be desired. Interestingly though, Mass Effect Andromeda fixed that and had excellent combat. Unfortunately, it dropped the ball on just about everything else. The combat and gunplay in Mass Effect is a bit of a crapshoot. It's a dice roll as to whether your Shepard will take cover or try to vault over it. Dodging is slow, and the guns feel incoherently different in every single game, making it annoying to stick to a gun-dependent class when the sniper rifle was awesome in the first game and awful in the second. Now, apparently the sniper rifle actually sucks in Mass Effect Andromeda too, but on the whole, that game really got its movement and combat mechanics right. The gunplay and traversal is night and day better than the original trilogy. Andromeda's Nomad vehicle is actually enjoyable to drive, the moment-to-moment combat is fluid and responsive, the game gives you a jetpack, and lets you attack with clever combos which add a whole other element to combat encounters. Unfortunately, Andromeda dropped the ball on everything the original trilogy nailed. Its story wasn't exciting, the characters paled in comparison to their counterparts in Mass Effect 1 to 3, and the writing was largely weak. That said, if they managed to combine the gameplay from Andromeda with everything else from the original trilogy, we are in for a hell of a future Mass Effect game. Number 5. Destiny. This might be a controversial one, but Destiny was a game that largely launched without its story or lore accessible within the experience. Bungie knew they were pushing gameplay to the forefront, and everything else was an afterthought. That said, the gameplay and movement mechanics in Destiny are almost without comparison. They're so very good that plenty of players were happy to overlook the story concerns when the game launched, and it's the reason they keep coming back. Destiny is a great example of a game that succeeded so comprehensively with its gameplay loop that its missteps elsewhere don't really matter. Every gun feels unique, the sights, sounds, and feedback of combat encounters are consistently satisfying, almost to the point that Destiny is in a class of its own in the first-person shooter genre. That said, the constant grind, lack of engaging social elements, unsatisfying additional content, aggressive monetization, and uninteresting narrative left plenty of players wanting. While plenty of players said they decided to give the game away as it started to feel like crossing off chores, many more just keep coming back because there aren't that many games that make gunplay feel this good. Number 4. Rage 2. It should come as no great surprise that the collaboration between Avalanche Studios and id Software created an FPS with phenomenal gameplay. It's perfectly controlled chaos set in a wildly saturated open world. Gunplay is delightfully fast-paced, and chaining clever kills alongside tactical choices of which powers to use and when is a blast. Then there's the monotonous open world that just begins to feel like a grind to explore, and the characters you can meet who you will meet and then wish you hadn't because they are flat and boring as hell. The world is a little too big for its own good, and though the core gameplay is exciting, there's not much to be excited about outside of it. Yet another example of a game that would have been a slam dunk if the rest of the game was anything like its core mechanics. Number 3. Dragon's Dogma. 2012 action RPG Dragon's Dogma does an excellent job of its party-based combat mechanics. The core gameplay loop succeeds on the back of combat encounters that feel substantial and flexible, a variety of ways to engage, and weighty hand-to-hand engagements. As a result, the game's had a substantial cult following despite its shortcomings, which come in the form of its weak narrative and unsatisfying story beats. The biggest problem is the way the game feels blatantly unfinished, especially in terms of its plot threads, many of which don't really go anywhere. For some people, those frayed ends and chaotic components worked, but for the majority, it was a bit of a letdown. Luckily, everyone could agree that the central mechanics absolutely nailed it. If the rumored sequel brushed up on the surrounding systems and narrative, it'd make for an incredible RPG. Number 2. The Surge 2. If you haven't played The Surge 2, I have to commit a cardinal sin by telling you it has Souls-esque combat. As much as that may be a cliche, it is true in this case in terms of the game's style and the quality of its gameplay mechanics. The 2019 offering from Deck 13 Interactive has been praised for its varied and refined approaches to combat, with stamina mechanics that demand strategy and a genuine heft to its mechanics. Players reported the gameplay being so good that it carried them through the whole experience, even though the game world felt washed out and empty with a bland setting and average voice acting for its characters. The monotonous environments and simple story may have been a sticking point, but the joy of its varied and tactically demanding combat kept plenty of people hooked. Number 1. Anthem. Anthem was such an infamously problematic game that a lot of people forgot that its gameplay was actually really solid. I say was, given that the game was lambasted so thoroughly that even the reboot that was planned from EA to actually address all of these issues and present the original vision of the game was scrapped. Similar to the case of Fallout 4, this is a game with such pedigree in its developer and publisher that it seemed fated to succeed. You could argue that with such anticipation from players, it could never live up to the hype, but Anthem still stumbled more than you'd expect. That's not to say it stumbles at the first hurdle. Your first experience, choosing your playstyle, flying through the gorgeous game world, playing with your abilities, engaging in the unique combat experience, and checking out the gunplay is fantastic. In fact, it's so fantastic you assume there has to be a really wonderful game under there somewhere. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all the game has going for it. Beyond the core gameplay mechanics, the mission structure was highly repetitive and unengaging, and the story was lackluster at best. On top of that, loot progression wasn't even satisfying, enemy AI needed serious work, and the entire experience felt unfinished and half-baked. Anthem is a blast to fight in, and it's a joy to get around the game world. It's just a shame there's not really anything worth seeing in it.
The conflict between hero and villain is often what makes a good story work. In almost all of fiction, the hero's motivation is counter to what the villain has done, is doing, or will do. Every step of the main character's journey is spurred on by the villain's scheming. The villain acts, the hero reacts, and the journey continues. Now, this is all a very simplified explanation of storytelling, but it demonstrates why these kind of fundamentals are so important. Because without a good villain, everything else ends up being kind of a dud. So with this in mind, I'm Dan from What Culture, and here are the 10 most disappointing video game villains. Number 10. The Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight. As great as Rocksteady's Batman Arkham series was, they always struggled with their villains. We all remember the oddly cringe Joker Bane monster thing at the end of Batman Arkham Asylum. Then Arkham City course corrected a bit by spreading out its major antagonist roles across a few characters. And finally, they settled on an original villain in Arkham Knight. Except he wasn't original, as anyone with even a cursory knowledge of Batman lore knew it was Jason Todd, the second Robin who was killed by the Joker, only to return as the lethal vigilante Red Hood. And that's all the Arkham Knight is. Red Hood with a different helmet. Rocksteady really should have just used Red Hood. The story would have been so much better served having the dynamic between Batman and Jason from the beginning, rather than saving it for an endgame twist that everyone saw coming. Number 9. The Collectors. Mass Effect 2. BioWare's Mass Effect had a pretty good villain in Saren, which was only made stronger by the prequel novel that preceded the original title, which raised the question of whether or not Saren was being controlled or influenced by some outside force, which made him much more compelling. Of course, in the end, we find out that he has in fact been indoctrinated by his ship, which was actually a swarm of synthetic life forms called the Reapers, who wipe out life in the galaxy every several thousand years. And after a reveal like that, you'd expect to face them in some form in the sequel. Instead, we got the Collectors, mindless insectoid drones abducting humans as biomass to create their equally disappointing human Reaper hybrid, which was literally just a giant T-800 from Terminator. Learning the sad fact that the Collectors are what became of the Protheans was a juicy bit of lore, but not when they've been wiped of everything that made the Protheans interesting in the first place. And for as good a game as Mass Effect 2 is, this was just straight up disappointing. Number 8. President John Henry Eden, Fallout 3. The secret US government cabal, the Enclave, seem to have met their end during the climax of Fallout 2. That game's protagonist, the Chosen One, not only destroyed their main base, but also killed their new president, so their return in Fallout 3 was a surprise. On the one hand, it made sense that the US government might try to regroup in Washington DC, where there are no established governments. On the other hand, their defeat in Fallout 2 seemed pretty definitive. But what you didn't see coming was a secret second president, who's a computer? A computer who broadcasts on the radio and mostly talks about how awesome he is. And somehow the voice of some guy they've never even heard of is more than enough to rally the Enclave. It just doesn't make a ton of sense. The Enclave had a power structure. You'd think they'd have a formal plan for succession, but no. They were kind of all just chilling, waiting for some random guy to declare himself president? How does anyone ever lose to these guys? Number 7. Skullface. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. On a technical and gameplay level, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain is a masterpiece. From a story perspective, however, it manages to be a disappointment compared to previous entries in the series. One major reason for this was the budgetary issues and subsequent falling out between designer Hideo Kojima and publisher Konami. But there were still issues present from the start, not the least of which being the primary villain, Skullface. For a series known for its iconic, over-the-top, hammy bad guys, the contrastingly restrained Skullface just couldn't live up to the bombastic tone of the games. Skullface simply does not have the charisma or personality to carry as much of the narrative as he needed to. Subdued nihilism can be a very interesting character trait, but when up against Snake's usual cast of villains who possess all the subtlety of pro wrestlers, anything less gets drowned out. Number 6. Lou and Mickey. Far Cry New Dawn. Confusingly, Ubisoft's Far Cry spin-off, New Dawn, is the only Far Cry game to take place after Far Cry 5's ending, in which the world is destroyed in a nuclear war. New Dawn is an enjoyable game, but unfortunately, for a series made exponentially more famous by its villains, Raider twins Lou and Mickey are probably the most forgettable in the entire series. While Far Cry's villains may have peaked early, with Far Cry 3's Voss, Lou and Mickey still managed to fall excessively far behind. Just about every other Far Cry villain has some sort of philosophy or guiding principle. The twins say they have some sort of vision for the future, but damned if anyone can actually figure out what that is. All they do is find the craziest people to give guns to and mostly let them run wild, while they play around on their dirt bikes. Number 5. Corypheus. Dragon Age Inquisition. One thing BioWare's Dragon Age series has going for it is the world building, which is enhanced by the fact that the writers don't have to explain everything. Amongst those mysterious details is what really resulted in the dreaded Archdemons being unleashed onto the world. All we know is that things went horribly awry when a group of ancient mages tried to enter the Golden City and corrupted it. And ever since then, things have just been bad. One of those mages is Corypheus, who escapes from his prison and returns to the world to do terrible things. However, for a major player in the most important catastrophe to ever befall this world, his priorities seem a tad skewed. In a world of old gods, darkspawn, and demons, Corypheus' main goal is to make all elves slaves and exterminate other non-humans. So basically, he's a giant racist. And what about the Golden City? His fellow mages are still imprisoned, so shouldn't he want to free them or something? Nah, right now the elves gotta be put in their place, and then we'll see. Maybe. Number 4. Devin Weston, Grand Theft Auto 5. Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto series has never leaned too heavy on its villains. After all, some of the most colourful villains in the series are its protagonists. It's hard to top Vice City's Tommy Vercetti as a bad dude, but it's equally as hard to get more forgettable than GTA 5's Devin Weston. Unlike the gangsters and dirty cops who make up most of the GTA cast, Weston is basically just your average rich guy, and after trying to steal everything from the 3 protagonists, Weston is easily kidnapped and stuffed in the trunk of a car. He of course begs for his life, with the promise of the only thing that he has, money. And that's a hollow promise, since like every GTA game, you probably have more money than you could ever know how to spend by the game's end. And the second you lock him back in the trunk and push the car off a cliff, you've probably already forgotten this guy ever existed. Number 3. The Speaker, Gears of War 4. General Ram, Scourge, the Locust Queen herself. These are the 3 main antagonists in the original Gears of War trilogy, and they were all badass and unique in their own right. These villains elevated the games that they were in, and did a damn good job of looking cool while they did it. Roll on Gears of War 4, the Coalition's first attempt at a Gears game, after Epic sold the franchise to Microsoft. And while it's generally considered as one of the weakest games in the series, there are elements present in this game which work incredibly well. The main villain, however, is not one of those elements. Known as the Speaker, this big bad present in Gears 4 was just plain boring. Sure, the boss fight versus the Swarmak is kinda cool on a first playthrough, but that has nothing to do with the Speaker. Visually, he looks just like any other Scion present in Gears 4, and his bland design is complemented by an even blander, generic evil personality. Again, this is following the likes of General Ram, who was just a total badass and was so menacing. The Speaker was just mind-numbingly dull, and was such a letdown to most fans of the franchise. And just like any other grub, he got curb-stomped back into his hole. Number 2. Scott Shelby, Heavy Rain. Now, I don't hate Heavy Rain. It has some interesting ideas that almost come together, but by the end, it goes completely off the rails. Heavy Rain is a game where you alternate between 4 characters, all hunting down the same serial killer, known as the Origami Killer. So, who is the Origami Killer? Well, it turns out he's one of those 4 playable characters, Private Detective Scott Shelby. Through a series of flashbacks, we learn not only of Shelby's motive, but then we also see that the game was basically just lying to us whenever we controlled him, twisting the narrative and not showing us what really happened, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. And number 1, Necron, Final Fantasy IX. Okay, we get it. For a game about existentialism, in which every major character is facing their own existential crisis, you have to include death in there somewhere, right? But saving it for the very end of the game, where the concept of death is embodied by a last-second boss encounter that literally appears out of nowhere and is more or less immediately forgotten about, isn't what I'd call, well, good. After saving the world from the game's actual villain, our protagonist is suddenly addressed by a mysterious voice, Necron. He says he's been observing the game's events and has concluded that life only exists to die. So he's gonna kill everything. You then fight and beat him, and he's undone by the revelation of how powerful the will to live actually is. That's the entirety of this guy's role in the game. Pretty much a weird, dark, edgy, teenage journal entry condensed into a boss fight.
Most people can't afford to buy every new video game when it comes out, so it makes sense to pick and choose the options that appeal to you the most. You want to play games that excite you or perhaps feel like a safe bet, which makes it sting all the more when this goes wrong. How could something you placed your trust in burn you like that? This is where real and often valid gamer rage comes from, investing your money and time into something only for it to let you down. Because I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 disappointing video games that made you rage quit. Number 10, Grand Theft Auto: The Trilogy Definitive Edition. It's easy to chastise Rockstar for charging full price for a barely upscaled port of Red Dead Redemption, and you should do it, but in concept, GTA The Trilogy Definitive Edition was a more reasonable affair. 3 classic PS2 games all released as one for $60 wasn't a dreadful deal, until it became apparent that the company hadn't supplied review copies of the game to any outlet on the lead up to release. The marketing was already slim as it was, and people were worried as to why. Of course, their concerns were justified. The game bombed on release thanks to its terrible textures, nightmare-fuel character models, vision-obscuring weather effects, and a new selection of glitches. Not enough attention was paid to crafting an HD experience of the originals, and instead it all felt like it had been upscaled by the mindless push of a button, which, considering it had partially used AI, wasn't totally untrue. There was missing music and cheats, and to make matters worse, Definitive Edition had been designed to replace the old versions that had been pulled from store shelves. It was horrible to see the games in this state, considering that all 3 titles easily added up to well over 60 hours of content. There's no way that the vast majority of players saw it through. You were much better off dragging the PlayStation 2 out of the attic. Number 9, Battlefield 2042. According to Steam charts, the PC player base for Battlefield 2042 started strong on release in November 2021. In fact, on opening weekend, the game hit over 100,000 players, more than either Battlefield 5 or 1 managed in their respective lifetimes. However, this number had halved after the first month, and by the end of the year, the community was a tenth of its original size, and had dropped to fewer concurrent players than predecessor Battlefield 5. Critics gave Battlefield 2042 good but not great scores. However, the franchise's fans were extremely unhappy, leaving scathing reviews wherever they could. There was a laundry list of issues with 2042. The lack of a story mode in the title was already a worrying revelation, but the time had not been spent elsewhere. The game had less guns, less maps, and nonsense changes. Throwing out the tried and tested class system for the new specialist system felt restrictive and stank of desperation because of the microtransactions based on each specialist's skin. The other major change and selling point were the massive 64-player matches. Naturally, this led to a game that most systems could barely run, as was evidenced by the endless storm of glitches and crashes experienced by every Battlefield player. And by the time the patches came, these players had tuned out and gone elsewhere. Number 8, The Quiet Man. Square Enix might be one of the biggest third-party companies in the industry, but they've hardly got an unblemished record. The Quiet Man, which focused on the story of deaf protagonist Dane, might be the most confusing and downright awful title that they've put their name to, however. Trailers didn't say a lot, pun unintended, but seemed to imply a title that seamlessly moved from gameplay to live action and back again. The hook of Dane's disability seemed like an exciting and rare chance for gaming to break new ground and do so inclusively. Surely a deaf protagonist could present an interesting challenge for developers and a chance for a unique gameplay experience. And that might still be the case, but The Quiet Man wasn't the game to do it. Dane's deafness felt like nothing more than a marketing tactic and in fact a storytelling hindrance. The plot was hard to follow, not for Dane, who was used to his deafness and could partake in the world, but for players who were made to experience the game without any audio, subtitles, or any other prompts. His deafness didn't even factor into the story whatsoever, nor the gameplay. The smooth editing of the trailers hid the fact that the 4 to 6 hour experience was largely cutscenes. Despite being a very short title, nobody wants to sit through hours of a story that doesn't bother to explain itself, interspersed with pretty terrible generic combat sequences. Number 7, Crackdown 3. At one point, Microsoft tried really hard to make Crackdown one of their hottest IPs. Their vision for total citywide destruction and mayhem was certainly an inviting one, and the first game landed well. However, its sequel largely reviewed as a bit of a letdown by comparison. Despite this, fans of the franchise were unhappy when the third entry got delayed from 2016 to 2019, but it made for more time to turn Crackdown 3 into something that pushed the series forwards. And gaming at large, in fact, as Crackdown 3 promised to use cloud server technologies like never before. In an impressive reveal demo, the destruction players were promised to be able to wreak was unprecedented, allowing for entire buildings to be toppled into one another. However, in the final game, this was far from the case. The cloud-based destruction wasn't included in the story, which felt entirely flat and dated without it. And in the multiplayer, where it did seem to exist, it had been severely scaled back. With only around 30% of players unlocking the game's achievement for beating the final boss on any difficulty, it's pretty clear that gamers had felt lied to about what Crackdown 3 was. Number 6, Sonic Heroes. 3D Sonic games weren't always abject failures. For example, Sonic Adventure 2 is celebrated as one of the best games in the series. But then Sonic Heroes reared its head as the precursor of what was was to come. This janky 3D platformer had all the issues that came to be synonymous with the Hedgehog and Friends, including argumentative camera control and terrible hit detection. It was also far more simple and straightforward compared to the tone that the adventure games had crafted. Fans hoping for Adventure 3 were sorely let down. But once you get past a single playthrough of the game's jank, it's far from over. Sonic Heroes represents perhaps the best of the glut of Sonic the Hedgehog's cast, with there being technically 12 playable characters, all in groups of 3. So whilst you may have beaten the game as Sonic, Tails and Knuckles, you're less than a quarter of the way there. There are 3 more runs to do and an unlockable last story, which are pretty much all exactly the same. Sure, the edgy Team Dark might have more enemies, Team Rose might be easy mode, and Team Chaotix are sent on wild goose chases for items rather than looking for a goal ring, but all 4 teams navigate every zone in the game in the same order. Getting through it once was bad enough, but 4 times? Most people would rather spin dash off a cliff. Number 5, Deathloop. Occasionally a game studio comes along and repeatedly smashes it out of the park so hard that keeping an eye on what they do next is mandatory. Arcane Studios made a real name for themselves with the success of the Dishonored duology, so publisher Bethesda Softworks were understandably keen to hit the marketing hard on their next project. And for a while you couldn't go a month without seeing Deathloop marketing promising a unique roguelike approach to their open-ended formula. The problem, of course, was making the hook of repetition work in a way that kept players invested, which seemed to be a hit and miss affair. Complaints from gamers about having to sit through the same dialogue rolled in, as well as about the game's length, variety and linearity. Even with replaying parts over again armed with new knowledge, the game seemed to be much more restrictive than Arcane's previous work. Where puzzles could be solved in a variety of ways before, Deathloop seemed comparatively boxed in, and worse yet, offered poor rewards for doing so. Complaints were also levied against its poor AI and an unsatisfying story. It's perhaps not fair to say Deathloop angered players so much as bored them until they couldn't take it anymore. At least Arcane could pick up the slack on their next game, right? What was that again? Redfall. It was Redfall. Oh. Number 4, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 was so bad that instead of reviving the skating genre, it nearly killed it off for good. And to be fair, lots of people saw this coming as marketing was slim, but what was shown was more than a little concerning. Complaints about Pro Skater 5's graphics were brushed off by the publisher, who chose to adopt a cel-shaded style to hide its blemishes. It was no surprise that the finished version of the game screamed rush job, but it was way worse than anyone anticipated. Nowhere was this clearer than the day 1 8GB patch, which was essentially the entire game, as the disc only contained the tutorial and little else. It stung for die-hard fans as well as the general wider public. There were surely those who picked it up on name value alone. After all, deliberately branding it as the 5th game in the mainline Pro Skater series certainly grabbed the attention of those who had played the originals. Pro Skater 4 by this point was about 15 years old, so was prime for some nostalgia. Pro Skater 5 preyed on those good feelings, delivering a content-light, broken mess of a product. Its main story clocks in at around 3 hours, which was more than enough time to drive players away from what little else it presented. Number 3, Biomutant. In a sense, it's easy to feel sorry for Experiment 101, the developers for Biomutant. Their small team's passion for their little third-person action role-playing indie game blew up more than they probably anticipated. With its rodent tribes at war on post-nuclear Earth concept and bright and exciting character designs, it's no surprise that it caught attention. After being scooped up by THQ Nordic, the marketing budget for the game was greatly expanded to take advantage of its natural interest. The problem was that to make back all this marketing budget, the game had to launch at a full price of $60, when really it was still just an indie game at heart. Thus, fans who had waited from the 2018 reveal to the 2021 release date were largely sorely let down by the finished product, as evidenced by the discourse that followed. The world was empty, the quest lines were repetitive, the combat was imprecise, and the story felt incredibly underwhelming. The game's promise of moral choices to be made amounted to 2 identical playthroughs. Almost all of the game's PS4 trophies sit around the 20% completion mark, meaning that those who did part with money for Biomutant spent infinitely more time waiting for it to release than actually playing it. Number 2, Metroid Other M. An underwhelming game can leave you cold in any area, but sometimes make up for it elsewhere. Titles can have a bad story, but you might not care because the gameplay is so addictive. On the flip side, a game might play gameplay in a way that feels disappointing but could have a great narrative and enrapturing characters, so you push through to see the story to the end. Metroid Other M turned off players from both of these angles, making it almost certainly the most abandoned adventure in Samus Aran's history. The character assassination of Samus Aran, who at this point has saved the world multiple times, listening to the orders of a bunch of soldier bros was insulting to long-time fans. But in general, the gameplay is just completely unengaging, trying to combine both 2D and 3D styles and doing so on a solitary Wii remote with no nunchuck makes for an uncomfortable experience, as players have to continuously swap from one to the other by repositioning the controller in their hand if they want to aim at the screen. Not only did Other M make players rage quit, it also caused Nintendo to abandon Samus Aran's adventures for a full 7 years until 2017's Metroid 2 remake.
We've mentioned it plenty of times before, but it does bear repeating. Boss battles are important, but not exactly easy to get right. Often they can just become repetitive and tedious, and they can accidentally conflate long with enjoyably challenging. Whether it be ugly character design, cheap mechanics, or spectacularly failing to live up to expectations, all the entrants on this list are a blight on the games they appear in, and a warning letter to video game designers everywhere on how not to create a boss fight. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 painfully disappointing boss battles. Number 10, Icon of Sin, Doom Eternal. The satanic kaiju that is the Icon of Sin certainly makes for a great visual, but when it comes to your actual confrontation, well, there's a reason that pretty much the entirety of the clips of fighting this thing are of goons and not the thing itself, because that's what you're mostly going to be dealing with. Like most skyscraper tall bosses, the Icon has overly telegraphed attack animations which are way too easy to avoid. Unfortunately, id Software attempt to get around this by throwing hordes of monsters at the player during the fight as a distraction. One of the cheapest tactics in the book. Being mobbed by henchmen while fighting a boss is every bit as annoying as being swarmed by flies while trying to enjoy a delicious sandwich. Except you don't even get the satisfaction of eating the sandwich, just a lingering feeling of resentment at the developers for wasting your time. A great monster design unfortunately wasted on a crappy fight. This one is definitely an example of where style has won over substance. Number 9, Dark Inferno, Kingdom Hearts 3. Comparatively, this one is an example of where great expectations meet the cold, hard facts of reality. In this reality, it's a bad boss fight. Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 had two of the best secret boss battles in gaming, a pair of challenging, nerve-wracking duels against Final Fantasy VII Sephiroth, one of the most famous villains in all of gaming. Naturally, it was easy to assume we'd be getting a trilogy-topping fight against the platinum-haired bastard in the long-awaited Kingdom Hearts 3. Instead, we got Dark Inferno. Who is Dark Inferno, you ask? Well, it's a character who doesn't really have any strong connection to the game and is instead sort of injected at the end to just provide an endgame challenge. Going up against Dark Inferno was a soul-crushing moment for those who'd been anticipating a repeat of two of gaming's greatest boss battles, and an affirmation that Nomura and his team had no interest in providing for the Final Fantasy fans that made up a big part of Kingdom Hearts' audience. Number 8, Mutated Jack, Resident Evil 7. It's rare to be able to pick the exact moment a game jumps the shark. It's usually the case that poor level design, unfair mechanics, or even simple technical issues slowly strangle the life from a game until it becomes impossible to enjoy. This wasn't the case, however, in Resident Evil 7, as thankfully the kind people at Capcom gave us a boss battle encounter that may as well have just shot up a giant sign that said, "Hey, you can stop playing now, we're all out of ideas." Arriving at around 2/3 of the way through the game, the boss fight against Mutated Jack is exactly the sort of rote, unimaginative schlock that the game had been so good at avoiding up until that point. A dull, shoot the glowing weak points to win arena fight, Mutated Jack signifies the lack of innovation that plagued the final third of Resi 7. While it's undoubtedly disappointing that Capcom couldn't maintain the high standards of the game's first half dozen hours all the way through the end, at least they were decent enough to let us know when we could call it a day. Number 7, Bowser in a Bathtub, Super Mario Sunshine. Super Mario Sunshine. It may be a fan favorite, but it's also a game so laid back that its final boss couldn't even be bothered to get out of the tub to fight you. No, really, the entire fight is you breaking the bath to drain the water and flush Bowser out, which sounds like a humorous prelude to the actual fight, but no. That's your lot. It's hard to see what Nintendo were trying to achieve here. Bowser's never been the most effective villain, but this felt like the company making a bad joke at our expense. You'll beat him anyway, so we don't need to make him appear threatening. Portraying your villain as a joke is generally not a great idea, as it makes players feel like their entire journey to getting good enough to face off against him was kind of for nothing. Nintendo did make up for this with the Galaxy game's epic planet-hopping Bowser battles, but even 18 years on, Super Mario Sunshine's final boss feels like a bizarre misstep from its creators. Mother Demon, Doom 64. In the original article for this list, we linked a video where the battle against Mother Demon begins at 34 seconds. Exactly 34 seconds. When does it end? 6 seconds later. Yes, there's the argument that the player we were featuring is using the game's ultimate weapon, but come on, a game's final boss shouldn't be dispatched as if it was some kind of random mook. Presumably, the justification for making this fight so laughably short is that the developers were hoping no one would notice that the Mother Demon looks like someone stuck a deformed goat skull on Mr. Hanky and called it a day. Doom, we love you so much, but please do better with your bosses. Number 5, Shao Kahn, Mortal Kombat 9. Putting the painful in painfully disappointing, Shao Kahn resulted in the death of many a controller due to his ridiculous health bar, hard-hitting attacks, and blatant cheating. Having said that, we're kind of using Shao Kahn as a stand-in here for just an overall really irritating boss archetype, and that's the SNK boss. Dear fighting game developers, please stop making final bosses that ignore the rules of your own game. It's literally no fun to fight a character that blatantly ignores your attacks. All this results in is players having to find the one move that actually works and then spamming it. Shao Kahn was chosen as an example for this type of boss because he's a rare example of developers who learned from their mistakes. The final bosses of Mortal Kombat's 10 and 11 were both much fairer, and were therefore actually satisfying to fight. Our now feces-free walls, thank you for your understanding, NetherRealm Studios. Number 4, Baby Reaper, Mass Effect 2. Oh god, the Baby Reaper. You know when we say it like that, just as 2 words, it kind of sounds like a really interesting outtake from a bad horror film, like a so bad it's good horror film, but instead, again, it's just a not very good boss fight. Mass Effect 2 is rightly seen as one of the greatest games of the previous console generation. Its final suicide mission especially is a watershed moment in game design, as everything you've done up until that point comes into play in one last desperate assault on the enemy fortress. It's tense, it's thrilling, it's emotional, and then you fight a giant Terminator ripoff at the very end. Or Big Fuzz from Contra 3 if you're a video game nerd. It's not like Mass Effect didn't have effective bad guys of its own to pull inspiration from. The Insectoid Collectors, whose base you're assaulting, and Lovecraftian Reapers would have made for a far less ridiculous looking boss than the Baby Reaper and its cheesy, unoriginal design. Mass Effect 2's final boss is a great example of how a game can get it 99% right and still kind of fail at sticking the landing. But at least BioWare would prove consistency because they did it again in Mass Effect 3. Number 3, 343 Guilty Spark, Halo 3. How to make an effective video game baddie. Number 1, have it betray you. Check. Number 2, have it kill off a fan favorite character, and check. Number 3, give it a meaningful final battle against the player. As the song says, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Like the aforementioned boss against Mother Demon, this one doesn't work because it's just so laughably mismatched between you and your antagonist. A cyborg super soldier against a cyberpunk football helmet, with the ensuing fight lasting exactly as long as you'd expect it would after hearing that description. Its true disappointment comes from its place in the narrative. This is right at the conclusion of the trilogy, and the realization that this is as close as the game will come to a climactic battle is a bitter one. This is one fight that Master Chief would have been better off not starting, let alone finishing. Number 2. Tyrene the Destroyer, Borderlands 3. Developers, please stop having characters declare themselves gods only to mutate into a form that makes them resemble a character from Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Dull visual design aside, this one was just a chore. Unfortunately, we were capping off the trilogy with just another giant brute in a game that was already replete with them. This felt like the final insult in an already disappointing sequel that had clearly stopped trying to reach the heights of the previous games in the franchise. After the brilliance of Handsome Jack, the Calypso twins were a huge letdown, and this tedious, unchallenging boss fight acted as a final reminder of just how far from grace the Borderlands series had fallen. Number 1. Aurora Unit 313, Metroid Prime 3. It really starts with the name on this one. Aurora Unit 313, a designation so forgettable that it's probably already left your memory unless you already have experience with this one, and then you're probably just upset about it. Another thing that might make you actually remember it though is its absurd phallic design. It does look like someone stuck a metal head crab on a giraffe's neck. But more than that, it's how utterly forgettable the fight itself is. This is the finale of Metroid Prime, a series with some of the greatest boss battles in gaming history. Flagra from MP1, Quadraxis from MP2, even Meta Ridley from earlier in MP3. All great battles, and all ones that provide moments that will live long in a gamer's memory. But this was just a dust-up with a robot that looks like it had been designed like 5 minutes before the deadline was hitting. It's almost unbelievable that Retro Studios thought that this would be a suitable way to end one of the greatest trilogies in video games, and if Metroid Prime 4 ever comes out, hopefully it'll wash away the taste left by Aurora Unit 313. Our winner for gaming's most painfully disappointing boss battle, but do put your picks in the comments down below.
Securing a video game sequel with a killer story hook in place means self-generating interest in between installments. Sometimes even the most phoned-in titles gameplay-wise at least continue their overarching narratives and can be reappraised or revalued somewhere down the line. What about the times though, and they're often overlooked as we talk about the game portion of things being a little bit naff, that the stories themselves let us down? I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 7 most disappointing video game stories ever. Honorable mention goes to Mass Effect 3, a foregone conclusion for this kind of list and something we've covered more times than I can count. To shake things up, I'm gonna suggest you play the Legendary Edition instead, it actually being a complete experience that is significantly better assembled and polished than back in 2012. Number 7. Halo 5. With Halo Infinite largely doing away with the more somber tone of Halos 4 and 5, likely because legendary original trilogy writer Joseph Staten is back on board, it's a marked regaining of focus from just how messy Halo 5 felt. Reeling from the death of Cortana, and with 343 Industries thanking fans for believing in their vision for the IP during the credits, Halo 5 then rolled out an entire marketing campaign centered on Master Chief fighting with relative newcomer Spartan Locke. John 117 had recruited his childhood soldier friends to help while Locke amassed his own platoon of Spartans. The two sides set to have some kind of showdown, with the real reason behind their rivalry to be revealed. Cut to the game, and not only was the Chief versus Locke fight over in seconds, but the advertised scene of Locke and Chief pulling a gun on each other never happened. The real reason Chief was on the run came down to investigating signs that Cortana was still alive, something Locke empathized with almost immediately, and we ended with Cortana becoming the main villain for the next installment. Help us, Halo Infinite, you're our only hope. Number 6. No Man's Sky. Shoe-in for most miles traveled between the launch version and where it is today, No Man's Sky is one of the most impressive bodies of work from a gaming studio in history, but as we all know, that first year was bumpy as hell. Sidestepping the many bugs and reality of how mismarketed the project was, one key reason behind exploring in the first place was to see what lay at the center of the galaxy. Creative director Sean Murray teased what lay at the end of the line, saying there is something you can do, and that it causes an event that is seen by everybody. He said we'd want to experience it with friends and get them to join us there, almost like the digital equivalent of some ethereal nirvana state set aside for only the bravest adventurers. Get to the heart of the galaxy, something that takes tens of hours, if not hundreds, depending on your trajectory through billions of planets, and you're rewarded with the camera zooming back out past all the planets in the cosmos as the whole game restarts. Newer updates have codified this sequence, and even the earliest versions of No Man's Sky were a meta-narrative comment on life being a simulation, i.e. just playing the game itself, but neither are anywhere near the way Murray was describing this event. Number 5. Resident Evil Village. Potentially a controversial pick depending on how much you were invested in this mysterious new version of Chris Redfield, someone whose first order of business in Resident Evil Village is to shoot Ethan's wife Mia and steal their child. Yes, that's the setup of Resident Evil's 8th installment, and besides the closing months of marketing when Lady Dimitrescu's thirst was in full flow, the core question of what Chris was doing was front and center. Well, the explanation is possibly the stupidest thing Capcom have ever written, and in a world of boulder punches and duels to the death in a volcano, that's really saying something. The reason Chris shot Mia was because she was actually Mother Miranda, long-lost partner of Mr. Zombie Virus himself, Oswell E. Spencer. Chris simply chooses not to tell a clearly very disturbed Ethan what's going on, and makes off with infant child Rosemary because she too is being sought after by various members of the upcoming village. There was literally zero reason Chris couldn't have told Ethan what was going on, and as he repeatedly shows up telling Ethan not to get involved with no explanation, of course the husband of a murdered wife and father of a kidnapped infant is gonna follow you to the ends of the earth. All this, and I'm leaving out another particularly moldy reveal that comes later on, because at least that tied into Resident Evil 7. Number 4. Death Stranding. A game whose premise is its entire narrative, Hideo Kojima's blank check feeling game about human togetherness in a bleak post-apocalyptic hellscape is genuinely a very rewarding, methodic, and unique game. It's also clearly the mind of someone who had 20 different thematic ideas across the decades he was with a former company and decided to throw them all into the mix. Death Stranding's core plot drive surrounds chasing after main man Sam Porter Bridges' kidnapped sister Amelie, but holy hell does it go off the rails around the midpoint. Everything from Sam being a time-traveling entity that knew Mads Mikkelsen's character to the baby on your front also being you as an infant is in here, but the big thing that feels supremely what is Amelie not even existing. Turns out she's actually an extinction entity, to which there have been many others in Earth's own history. The entire game revolves around realizing it's less about Sam finding his sister and recovering from an affliction that doesn't let him touch other people, and more about hugging the apocalypse itself, as a reminder that humanity is worth keeping around because companionship is irreplaceable. Said like that, this 50-hour noodle pile of a script has meaning, but Hideo Kojima is 100% his own worst enemy throughout. Number 3. Assassin's Creed 3. It might be a faint memory now, but Assassin's Creed 3 was the turning point. The point where original conceptual lead Patrice Désilets left Ubisoft, and the original plan for Assassin's Creed as a set of 6 games was thrown out the window. Desmond voice actor Nolan North revealed in 2015 that this original plan would have seen Desmond turn into an ultimate time-traveling assassin by the end of all games combined, having inherited and learned all the best techniques from the likes of Altair, Ezio, Connor, and more. Instead, as Désilets left, Ubisoft chose endless sequels over narrative satisfaction. Desmond suddenly had to touch a mythical underground orb that would save the planet and kill him, because of course it would. He does, the world is apparently saved, and Nolan North was asked to read some audible diary entries in Black Flag, as the franchise would only get more bloated and less character-focused over time. Number 2. The Last of Us Part 2. A divisive entry for sure, but one that I'm curious to put out there, just to see where people come down now that we're more than a year after such a notably chaotic launch. Because The Last of Us 2 is bold, it's meticulously made, it's award-winning, and a notably high bar for digital performance capture. It also employs a completely different tone to its predecessor, and though it eventually lands on the same beat of life is worth living, find someone you love and make some memories, the path there involves killing main character Joel, perhaps the most passionately defended or at least talked about character in the last 10 years. To so wildly steer into breaking up the Joel and Ellie dynamic that made The Last of Us so seismic is one hell of a creative decision. It put us in the shoes of his killer, Abby, a character whose father was the surgeon Joel had killed at the close of the first game. The Last of Us 2's entire story is ultimately about understanding your enemy and why they do what they do. But I'm yet to meet a single person who, when going up against Ellie as Abby, didn't immediately discard the previous 10 hours walked in her shoes just to let Ellie have her revenge anyway. Great art should move you, and The Last of Us 2 is a powerful palm-first shove to the notion that any sequel should be what you expect. How it sits now, though, is what's really fascinating to discuss. And number 1, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. If we're factoring in how much a story had to gain and how much it had to lose, Metal Gear Solid 5 takes the cake. Seeing Hideo Kojima return to the franchise that made him a household name, 5 years after 8 hours of cutscenes wrapped up every remaining plot thread in MGS4, it was going to take an incredible hook to convince anyone to come back. Well, after a bizarre chunk of time where Kojima pretended to be fake video game developer Joachim Mogrim, creating Phantom Pain under the name Moby Dick Studios, it was revealed MGS5 would be the missing link between both portions of the main timeline. With Metal Gear Solid 3, Portable Ops, and Peace Walker being set in the 80s, and Metal Gear 1, 2, Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 4 being set in the late 90s, 2000s, and beyond, the connective tissue was Big Boss, the hero of the former titles who had lost his mind in the latter. What could have driven him to such madness? Why did he give up on America and his duty as a soldier? Tune in to find out. Obviously, this game was dogged by a very public spat between Kojima and Konami, but the reality is there was very little in here to address that core question anyway. More narrative ground was covered in Peace Walker when it came to Snake's fracturing mental state, and that was before Phantom Pain brought in flying whales, resurrected Metal Gear 3's Volgin as a man made of fire, and revealed even this version of Snake was actually a clone, with the real Big Boss still doing his thing somewhere else.
A good video game finale might not necessarily make or break a series, but as the last impression that you're left with, it's still pretty darn important. While some video games manage to end on the perfect note with a satisfying tying up of narrative threads and meaningful payoff in the development of their characters and plot lines, some are, well, not so great. Whether they petered out rather than concluded with a bang, left too much unresolved, or appeared to betray the motivations and goals of their central character, these game endings were kind of the worst. For now, let's commiserate on these unsatisfying endings, crappy conclusions, routine roundups, and depressing denouements, which we wish had gone a little differently. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are the 9 most disappointing video game finales. Number 9, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Metal Gear Solid. If you played this one, chances are you're not surprised it's gotten a slot on this not so illustrious list, so let's just get it out of the way early. After an enormously compelling saga peppered with memorable twists, fantastic characters, incredible set pieces, and more snakes than you can shake a stick at, fans were understandably hyped for Metal Gear's epic conclusion that was The Phantom Pain. Now things don't get off to a bad start here. The story is unusual, but not alarmingly so, especially since Metal Gear aficionados are always prepared for things to get a little kooky, or a lot kooky. That isn't the problem. What is the problem is the end of the game, which reeks of the relationship breakdown between creator Hideo Kojima and publisher Konami. After culminating in an exciting face-off between Venom, Snake, and Skullface, things just sort of peter off. There's a lot of game left, but most of what you'll be doing is repeating the missions you've already done, and by the end there are more than a few plot threads hanging and nothing quite comes together. To put it bluntly, unfinished and unsatisfying are only the tip of the iceberg to the disappointment fans experienced when reaching the end of this seminal video game series. Number 8, The Darkness 2: The Darkness. Let it not be said a game has to have a bunch of entries in its series to massively disappoint fans, especially when we're talking about a series as popular as The Darkness. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a cliffhanger ending or an ending that leaves some plot threads dangling. It can work, but in this instance, it left a lot of fans wondering what they were fighting for through The Darkness 2 and its original, especially given their growing fondness for one of the world's unluckiest protagonists, Jackie Estacado. After having what can be described as having a really crap go of it, or to be a little more specific, enduring an assassination attempt, being possessed by a demonic force called the Darkness, watching his girlfriend get murdered, waking up in a literal hellscape, gang war shenanigans, getting hit by a train, being imprisoned in a mental institution, getting crucified, getting shot, and enduring like 100 other terrible things, we arrive at our conclusion. Here you have a choice, and spoiler alert, neither option is great. You can choose to stay in the fake asylum with a fake version of your dead girlfriend, or you can jump into hell to try and save her. Doing so will initially result in you saving her, after which she's possessed by the Angelus who opposes the Darkness, and thus leaves our hero trapped in the depths of hell with loose ends galore. Jackie screams out and everything fades to black. The end. Though there's been murmurings over the years that The Darkness 3 may come about, there's been nothing firm to suggest it will in the 11 years since the sequel. Number 7, The Third Birthday: Parasite Eve. A slightly deeper cut now, but one that features no better ending than anything else on this list, we have The Third Birthday by Hexadrive. The 2010 shooter published by Square Enix is the third game in the cult favorite Parasite Eve series, and was generally well received, topping the PSP charts in North America and gaining praise for its nuanced and unique gameplay elements, as well as its environments and score and visuals. Though many found the plot twists to be intriguing, it all gets a little too bizarre by the game's conclusion. Counter-twisted investigation agent Aya Brea is trying to stop the Eve, who intends to destroy humanity. In the threequel, she battles
battles her way through the game's grunts and utilizes the overdrive system to manipulate time. Long convoluted story short, the game drops you into a finale that not only has logical issues and plot holes galore, it also forces your protagonist, the one you've grown attached to be shot. This happens in order to save the world because of reasons. We don't get closure on who the bad guys really are or what their motives may be. There's wildly convoluted body swapping which retcons story points and betrays your character development, and Sense has long since left the building. Number 6, Episode 5, Polarized, Life is Strange. Okay, I've gone slightly off the rails here because technically this is one game, but since it was released in episodes, I'm gonna allow it. Also, I wrote the script, so who's gonna tell me no? Life is Strange is a fantastic evolution of the adventure genre, both in the format of its storytelling through time travel, its compelling story, decision-making mechanics, and relatable characters. Unfortunately for Studio Don't Nod, all this investment into the narrative and those within it means they really had to nail the finale. In a lot of ways, the story is very satisfying. There are surprising and shocking conclusions to a lot of the game's mysteries, and the time manipulation mechanics are woven in a meaningful and interesting way. Then we hit our endgame. Though you've been making choices the entire game as to how you want to act, who you want to side with, and how you're going to deal with a bunch of different situations, you end up at a binary choice. Not just that, you're given a binary choice that not only overshadows any choices you've made so far, it can nuke your town and everyone in it off the map if you go with one option, and the other one leads to the death of the one person who spurred your journey on from the get-go. While some were a fan of this ending, and to be fair, you have to be understanding of the limitations of choice-based narratives, especially when they're trying to tell a linear story, others were more than a little disappointed that it all came down to this. Number 5, Mankind Divided, Deus Ex. Critically acclaimed sci-fi RPG series Deus Ex won plenty of fans for its compelling themes, interesting characters, and refreshing freedom of choice. The series extends over 6 games between 2000's Deus Ex and 2016's Mankind Divided. Over this time, the player grew attached to the original protagonist JC Denton and later mainstay Adam Jensen. After discovering and deliberating over a series of difficult choices related to the technological implications of AI, the social and cultural impacts, and the inevitable moral quandaries, not to mention the ongoing conflict with the Illuminati, we find ourselves at the end of Mankind Divided. Despite the game itself largely impressing fans, the very end had a brief showdown before cutting to black, leaving many questions unanswered. The final encounters didn't feel particularly impactful, and many of the interesting things being set up at the end didn't have the opportunity to be realized. Being left at this point wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't very clear there was supposed to be more to come, but instead the story simply stopped. The ending was rushed out with the intention to have another game round out the narrative, but as these things go sometimes, that game never eventuated. Number 4, Desmond's Story, Assassin's Creed 3. Assassin's Creed is a series with dense lore, interconnected timelines, and a conflict spanning different protagonists and historical eras. It's also a series that doesn't always stick the landing. Falling firmly into that last category is Connor's outing in Assassin's Creed 3. Though the game was generally very well received for its narrative, gameplay mechanics, and well-realized setting, things fell apart for a lot of fans by the end. In the wildly anticlimactic ending, your entire character journey between 2 compelling protagonists ends with Connor's revenge journey concluding in killing his sworn nemesis Charles Lee in a tavern, and Desmond dying in a way that can only be described as, again, because reasons. He's forced to choose between giving his life to protect the world or, well, doom the world. This opened up possibilities for where the franchise could go from this point, but for fans deeply invested in the story and Desmond's character development so far, it felt like a betrayal. The original game's ending here was to have Lucy and Desmond defeat Abstergo, but when AC2 was a hit, it was decided more games were going to be made, so they had to change that. While this is great because we got more AC games, for better and worse depending on the title, it left us with a wildly unsatisfying ending. At least when AC3 came out. There is a little more to it in the recent games, but that would push us too far into spoiler territory. Number 3, Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect. While there's very little that hasn't been said about Mass Effect 3 and its wildly disappointing color-coded endings, We'd be remiss not to include it on this list, as it well and truly deserves it, so I hope you'll forgive me the rehash. An ending so controversial that BioWare had to release an extended cut version that was more satisfying. The seminal sci-fi trilogy ended not with a bang, but with a choice of your favorite primary color, or refusing a color. You could do that too. One ending would have you destroy the sentient AI big bads along with other AI life, some of whom you've become quite fond of. Another gave you control over the former, and the green option had you turn everyone into synthetic organic hybrids. That last one I found to be unusually popular with friends, but the way that everyone's eyes glow green as they're morphed into some hybrid just never sat right with me. Personally, I'm a control girly. This might not be so brutal if we hadn't spent dozens of hours building our relationship to Shepard as a protagonist and our crew, only for things to be unceremoniously petered out with little substance. While the extended cut did mend a lot of plot holes and fan concerns, a lot of the damage had already been done. At least the Citadel DLC went a ways to cheering up fans. Number 2, Dreamfall Chapters: The Longest Journey. This one is a little more niche, especially if you're not into adventure games, but not to worry, it's still disappointing. Dreamfall Chapters wraps up the trilogy that began with the 1999 adventure game The Longest Journey, which also happens to be my favorite game. Sorry, I will mention that every time. This sci-fi fantasy epic had built up so much lore and adoration for its characters, and continued 7 years later with Dreamfall: The Longest Journey. Yet 8 more years after the sequel already dropped an ending that basically left all its protagonists for dead and plot holes galore, we got Dreamfall Chapters, which also has an ambiguous as hell ending. It was the kind of ending that left you with far more questions than answers, and because the narrative and characters are the primary focus here, that was especially egregious, particularly because at this point, players had waited 15 years for the full story to be told. Part of the reason is that the final game was crowdfunded, and a lofty stretch goal promised one more game, and that would provide answers to the who, what, and whys, but that game was never made. If you like ambiguous endings, you might not have so much of a problem with this one, but it did leave a lot of die-hard fans wanting. Number 1, Episode 2, Half-Life 2. I know calling Half-Life 2 Episode 2 a finale is a painful truth, but after 16 years, it might be time to accept that this is the only finale we're ever gonna get for Valve's iconic shooter series. The gorgeously realized adventure with its deeply memorable environments and characters deserved better than to be left in limbo. But unfortunately, the third episode that was supposed to wrap up the story in a satisfying way never eventuated. So episode 2 isn't the finale we wanted, but it's the one we have right now. The conclusion of Half-Life 2 Episode 2 depicts the epic battle of Gordon and Pal's hard-fought fight against the Combine. Our heroes join forces with Resistance members who include Alex's father. They meet a group of scientists working on a rocket intended to close the portal, which the Combine are trying to use to summon more of their buddies. In the end, the scientists launch the rocket and succeed in closing the portal, but quickly after this, 2 Combine advisors advance on our heroes and kill Alex's father before the robot companion dog launches in to chase them off. While this was admittedly an effective and heart-wrenching cliffhanger on which to leave things between games, especially watching Alex sobbing over her dead father, it now serves as the end of the story, at least for the foreseeable future. While 2020's Half-Life Alyx, a VR prequel set 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2, does tie up some loose ends from Half-Life 2, to the point that some people even argue it could be considered Half-Life 3, given that it heavily references events in Half-Life 2 Episode 2, it still left a lot of fans wanting. Or at least wanting a VR headset, since that's the only way to play the bloody thing. At the end, exactly where we leave Gordon, Alex, and the other characters we've grown close to over the years so far is left agonizingly up in the air. In short, as impressive and impactful as the ending is as a narrative moment, it's a brutally unsatisfying finale to leave fans with.